There are people who will help anyone, anytime, with anything, even when they're tired, even when they're drowning themselves, even when they know the other person would never do the same for them. And on the outside, it looks like pure kindness, but on the inside, something far more complicated, far more psychological, and far more dangerous. Before we go deeper, here's a simple question for you. What would you do if helping everyone meant slowly destroying your own peace? Comment your thoughts below. Now, let's begin. Imagine someone standing in the middle of a crowded room. People are pulling at their sleeve. One needs advice, another needs a favor, as someone else wants emotional support. Another needs money, time, reassurance, guidance, a solution, a lifeline. And this person, this helper, says yes. Every single time, not because they want to, not because they have the energy, not because they even agree, but because saying yes feels safer than saying no. The narrator watches them carefully, studying the emotional pattern. They help others because helping others feels easier than facing their own emotions. They help others because it gives them temporary identity, temporary purpose, temporary meaning. They help others because the silence that comes after saying no feels unbearable. They help others because somewhere deep down, they fear being abandoned, rejected, or forgotten. In psychology, this behavior is called self-erasing. Altruism, a pattern where kindness becomes currency, and emotional exhaustion becomes normal. And here's where Jesse Livermore enters the story. Livermore was a trader, but more importantly, he understood human behavior at a surgical level. He once said, "People are not defeated by the market. They are defeated by their own habits." And this applies perfectly to the always helping personality. A helper thinks they're being strong, but Livermore would say this: "You're not being strong. You're being predictable." And in psychology and in markets, predictability gets exploited. The narrator pauses, letting the weight sink in. Think about it. If you're always available, people will treat your availability as a resource. If you're always saying yes, people stop respecting the value of your yes. If you always help without boundaries, people will assume you don't need boundaries. Livermore believed that the biggest losses in life come from ignoring the right moment to stop. Helpers ignore that moment every single day. Now the narrator zooms out. Why do helpers never stop? Because helping becomes their emotional investment. The same way traders get addicted to one more trade, helpers get addicted to one more rescue. The dopamine of being needed, the comfort of being useful, the illusion of control. It becomes their identity, and identities are the hardest things to break. But here's the deeper twist. Most helpers never ask themselves one crucial question: would these people still love me if I stopped helping? And the fear of the answer keeps them trapped. As this first section closes, the narrator prepares the audience. The next part will explore the psychological conflict behind this behavior, the emotional paradox that drives helpers to sacrifice themselves over and over again. Here's the line that cracks open the entire psychology of helpers. People don't always help because they're kind. Sometimes they help because they're afraid not to. The narrator opens this section with a question meant to unsettle the truth. Have you ever helped someone, not because you wanted to, but because you were scared of what would happen if you didn't? Comment your honest answer below. Now the deeper psychological conflict begins. The helper wakes up every day carrying an invisible, emotional weight, a tension between who they truly are and who they believe they must be. On one side, their real self, tired, drained, craving rest, craving boundaries, craving peace. On the other side, their performed self, cheerful, available, dependable, always ready to save the day. And between those two selves lives their biggest psychological paradox. They're exhausted by helping everyone, yet terrified of what will happen if they stop. This is where the narrator slows down, emphasizing the emotional conflict. Helpers don't fear being disliked. They fear becoming irrelevant. They don't fear saying no. They fear losing their place in people's minds. In childhood psychology, this is known as conditional belonging, a belief formed early in life that love must be earned. And the way to earn it is by being useful. So the helper grows up with an emotional algorithm. If I give, I stay valuable. If I stop giving, I disappear. This is where Jesse Livermore's philosophy merges with the psychology. Livermore often said that the worst traders are the ones who can't tolerate loss. Not just financial loss, but emotional loss. the loss of being right, being needed, being validated. In his world, people who needed constant validation made the worst decisions. They held on to losing traits too long. They followed the crowd to feel safe. They avoided discomfort instead of facing reality. And what is a helper if not someone who avoids emotional discomfort by giving too much? Livermore would have looked at a helper and said, "You're not helping because others need you. You're helping because you need them." That's the painful truth the narrator reveals. The urge to help becomes a shield, a way to avoid loneliness, rejection, or emotional emptiness. But here's the paradox inside the paradox. The more a helper gives, the more people expect. The more they say yes, as the less their yes is respected. The more they sacrifice, the more invisible they become. This is the psychological trap. Helpers become overused, overlooked, and undervalued. Not because people are cruel, but because people adapt to whatever you consistently offer. Just like markets adapt to predictable patterns. Livermore warned that when you repeat a behavior long enough, the world begins to price it in. It stops being special. It becomes normal. And once your kindness becomes normal, people stop seeing the cost behind it. The narrator watches the helper in silence, watching them smile while their energy drains. Watching them listen while their own mind is screaming. Watching them hold others together while falling apart quietly. And here lies the heartbreaking reality. Helpers often help everyone, except the one person who needs them the most themselves. As this section ends, the narrator prepares the audience for the next step in the following part. We'll explore the core psychological wound that creates lifelong helpers, the internal story that turns kindness into compulsion, and generosity into emotional survival. Here begins the heart of the entire story, the part most helpers never talk about, and rarely even admit to themselves. Because behind every person who always helps others, there is a psychological wound so old, so silent, so deeply stitched into their identity, that they mistake it for just who they are. Before we dive in, here's a question only the brave will answer. Do you think you help people because you want to? Because you're scared not to? Comment honestly below. It reveals more than you think. The narrator steps deeper into the internal landscape of the helper. Somewhere in their past, maybe in childhood, maybe in their teenage years, maybe during a painful relationship, someone taught them that love wasn't freely given. It had to be earned. Through behavior, through effort, through self-sacrifice, through silence, through obedience, through being easy, low maintenance, supportive, and always available. This is called learned caretaking, a phenomenon where a person becomes emotionally wired to prioritize others, because doing so once protected them from rejection or conflict. Imagine a child who sensed chaos in the home, parents fighting, stress hanging in the air like smoke, emotions too big for small shoulders. That child learned something powerful. If I stay quiet, things don't get worse. If I stay helpful, people fight less. If I support everyone, no one gets mad at me. If I help, I'm safe. What begins as survival becomes personality, becomes identity, becomes their entire way of existing in the world. And that identity follows them into adulthood. Now they help because they feel responsible for everyone's emotional stability. They help because they fear disappointing people. They help because being useful feels like the only way to deserve connection. They help because deep inside, they believe they are easier to love when they are giving. This is the core psychological wound. I am only valued when I'm helping. The narrator lets this truth echo, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is exactly the kind of pattern Jesse Livermore warned about in human behavior. People repeat the same emotional habits long after the environment that created them is gone. Livermore wasn't just a trader, he was a student of emotional repetition. He believed people lose in markets for the same reason they lose in life. They react to the present with emotions shaped by the past. The helper does the same. They're no longer that child needing safety, but their emotional system doesn't know that. So they continue fixing, supporting, carrying, saving. Long after the danger is past, long after the people around them stop appreciating it, long after it starts hurting them instead of helping them, Livermore would say. The hardest thing is breaking a behavior that once saved you, may now destroys you. So the helper keeps giving, even when it hurts, even when they're overlooked, even when they know they're being used. even when they know people wouldn't show up for them the same way. Because somewhere deep down, not helping feels unsafe. Wrong. Almost like betrayal. It's a psychological wound. This deeply ingrained belief that their worth depends on their usefulness is what creates a life of chronic overhelping. And unless they understand it, it will continue shaping every friendship, relationship, job, and emotional decision they make. As this section closes, the narrator prepares the next step, where we uncover how this wound affects their decision-making, their pattern of attracting the wrong people, and the way Livermore's worldview explains why helpers are often drawn to the very people who drain them the most. Here's the strange thing about helpers. They don't just help people, they attract people who expect to be helped. And that's not an accident. That's psychology. Before we open this chapter fully, answer this honestly. Have you ever attracted people who only show up when they need something? Drop your experience in the comments. It might help someone else feel understood. The narrator leans in, lowering the voice like revealing a secret truth. People who always help don't just give too much. They also choose the wrong people to give to, not intentionally, not consciously, but emotionally. See, the wound inside a helper acts like a magnet, drawing in those who take, consume, drain, or lean too heavily. Psychologists call this compatibility of wounds, not romantic compatibility, not personality compatibility, but emotional compatibility. To people whose flaws fit together in a way that feels familiar, even if it's unhealthy, so the helper attracts. People who feel entitled, people who love convenience, people who crave emotional labor without giving it back, people who want a place to unload but not a place to contribute, people who sense kindness and mistake it for permission. And here's the twist. The helper rarely attracts emotionally secure, self-responsible people, because secure people don't want to be rescued. The narrator pauses, letting the weight of this truth settle. This is exactly where Jesse Livermore's philosophy fits perfectly. Livermore studied markets, but what he really studied was behavioral patterns. He believed people unconsciously move toward situations that validate their emotional past. He would say, you repeat what you haven't healed, and helpers repeat relationships with people who need them, because it gives them the illusion of purpose, the illusion of meaning, the illusion of being important. It's the emotional version of a trader who keeps buying into the same losing setup, hoping this time it will pay off, hoping this time they won't lose, hoping this time their efforts will be appreciated, Livermore warned. The market punishes those who stay loyal to a pattern that no longer works, and life punishes helpers in the same way. Helpers stay loyal to draining people because they mistake familiarity for connection. They confuse emotional labor with intimacy. They confuse being needed with being valued. But the narrator sees the deeper problem. Helpers don't realize they are choosing people from a place of emotional deficit, not from emotional clarity. So they attract relationships where they give more than they receive. They support more than they are supported. They heal others but remain wounded themselves. They become the therapist, the counselor, the emotional sponge. Why? Because these roles feel familiar, comfortable, safe. It's not that helpers love these roles. It's that these roles feel like home, even if home was unhealthy. Livermore often said that traders get trapped because they follow their instincts. But their instincts are wired by their past losses. Helpers are the same. They follow their instinct to care, fix, support. But that instinct was built during a time when helping was survival, not choice. And until they understand that, they will continue attracting people who drain them, rather than people who appreciate them. The narrator now prepares the audience. In the next section, we'll enter the real turning point, a moment in every helper's life where their emotional system hits a breaking point. A moment when even their endless giving no longer protects them. A moment that forces them to face themselves in a way they never have before. Every helper eventually reaches one moment. A moment that changes everything. A moment they never forget. It doesn't happen suddenly. It builds quietly, slowly, silently, like pressure inside a cracked dam, until one day, it finally breaks. Before we enter that moment, here's your reflection point. Have you ever reached a moment where helping others hurt you more than helping yourself? Share your story in the comments. Someone out there needs to hear it. Now the narrator opens the scene. The helper wakes up one morning already exhausted. Their phone is buzzing. Messages, requests, people needing things, people expecting things, people treating their time like it costs nothing. At first, the helper does what they always do. They take a breath, push down their own feelings, and start saying yes. But something is different today. Their body feels heavier. Their mind feels crowded. Their heart feels drained in a way that's almost physical. And for the first time ever, yes feels like a weight they can't lift anymore. One friend needs emotional support. Another wants a last-minute favor. Someone else needs advice. Someone else is venting about a situation they've repeated 100 times, but never take responsibility for. Every request pulls at them like hands grabbing their clothes, and the helper does what they've always done. They keep giving, 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 until suddenly the narrator describes the exact moment everything shifts. It's a tiny moment, small, almost invisible. Maybe someone sends a message saying, "Hey, can you do this for me real quick?" No greeting, no care, no pause, just expectation. And for the first time, the helper can't respond. Not because they don't want to, but because they can't. Their brain goes quiet, their chest tightens, their eyes sting with exhaustion. This is called emotional burnout collapse, a psychological shutdown where the mind refuses to continue a pattern that has drained it for too long. The narrator explains the shock of this moment. Helpers don't explode. They don't scream. They don't confront. They don't tell anyone they're hurting. They just stop. And that silence terrifies them, because for the first time in their life, helping feels impossible. This breaking point is the moment Livermore would have predicted long ago. He believed every emotional pattern eventually hits what he called a pivot point, a moment when the consequences of a decision become too heavy to ignore. Livermore said, "A man will continue a losing habit until the pain of continuing becomes greater than the pain of changing." For helpers, this is that moment. The pain of saying yes finally outweighs the fear of saying no. The narrator describes the emotional earthquake inside them. Thoughts start swirling. Why am I always the one helping? Why do people come to me only when they need something? Why do I feel so alone even when I'm surrounded by people? Why does no one check on me the way I check on them? It hits them like a realization they should have had years ago. Their relationships aren't balanced. Their giving isn't appreciated. Their presence is being used, not valued. This realization is devastating, but it is also awakening, because at the breaking point, the helper sees a truth they've avoided their whole life. Helping was never the problem. But losing themselves was, Livermore said. Traders only change after a devastating loss, not because they want to, but because they must. Helpers reach the same emotional threshold. This moment becomes their wake-up call, their turning point, their first step toward understanding the cost of overgiving. As this section closes, the narrator prepares the next evolution. In the next part, we explore the emotional crash, the lowest point in the helper's journey, where their burnout forces them to confront everything they've avoided, and where the truth becomes impossible to hide from anymore. This is the darkest chapter in a helper's story, the emotional low point, the crash, the moment when everything they've been holding inside finally hits them at once. Before stepping into this moment, consider this. Have you ever helped people so much that you eventually felt invisible? Comment your experience. Your honesty might resonate with someone silently going through the same thing. Now the narrator begins. After the breaking point comes the collapse, heavy, quiet, internal collapse that no one sees. Because helpers are experts at hiding their pain. They smile through heartbreak. They encourage others while falling apart internally. They listen to problems while their own remain unresolved. They pretend to be strong because strength became their mask long ago, but emotional masks crack eventually. And the narrator describes the moment it finally breaks. The helper is alone, maybe sitting on their bed, or driving at night, or staring at their phone screen filled with messages they don't have the energy to answer. Their chest feels tight, their mind feels loud. Their heart feels like it's carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. And in that moment, for the first time ever, they realize they are surrounded by people, yet connected to no one. This is the emotional contradiction of helpers. They give everyone support, yet receive none. They comfort others, yet cry silently. They understand everyone's pain, yet feel misunderstood themselves. The narrator reveals the psychological truth. Helpers don't burn out because they give too much. They burn out because they give too much to the wrong people. They lower themselves so others can rise. They silence themselves so others feel heard. They sacrifice themselves so others feel supported. And now their body, their heart, their mind finally refuses to continue. This is where Jesse Livermore's philosophy hits hardest. Livermore believed that human behavior has a cycle: hope, effort, denial, pain, realization, collapse, change. Helpers live in this cycle every day. Livermore once said, "You can't stop a man from losing until he sees the truth for himself." And helpers, at this emotional low point, finally see the truth. They have been losing themselves trying to save everyone else, the narrator continues. At this stage, helpers experience emotional fatigue, mental fog, resentment, loneliness, self-doubt, silence, disconnection, and an aching question: why does no one treat me the way I treat them? It's not that people don't care. It's that the helper trained them not to, by always being available. The helper taught people to expect availability by never asking for help. They taught people to assume they don't need it. By hiding their pain, they taught people to believe they're strong. By never setting boundaries, they taught others to cross them. And now, in their lowest moment, the helper finally sees the consequences. Livermore called this the moment of clarity through collapse. The exact moment when emotional exhaustion forces the mind to see reality as it truly is, not through kindness, not through optimism, not through wishful thinking, but through raw truth. The narrator describes this transformation. The helper cries not because they're weak, but because they are human. And after spending years being strong for others, their heart is finally asking, "Who will be strong for me?" And this question hits like a shockwave. Because the answer is no one, not because people don't care, but because the helper never allowed anyone to be strong for them. They built a life where they carried everyone. And now, in their darkest moment, there is no one who knows how to carry them. This is the emotional low point.
The turning moment.
The crash that forces healing to begin. Because Livermore believed that collapse isn't the end, it's the beginning of wisdom. As this section ends, the narrator sets the stage for what comes next. In the next part, we explore the breakthrough, the moment where the helper finally understands the truth, learns their first rule of emotional investing, and begins shifting from self-sacrifice to self-respect. Here begins the shift, the quiet, unexpected, almost invisible shift, the moment where a helper starts to wake up. Not with anger, not with revenge, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Before we begin this transformation, answer this honestly. Do you believe helpers deserve the same love they give to others? Comment your truth. Your voice matters here. Now the narrator begins the slow rise after the emotional collapse. After the breakdown, after the emotional exhaustion, after the moment where the helper realized they had no one to lean on, something inside them changes. It doesn't rise loudly. It rises like a small whisper in a quiet room. You can't keep living like this. This tiny voice is the seed of self-awareness. At first, the helper tries to ignore it. They go back to their old habits, saying yes, being available, picking up emotional weight that isn't theirs. But something feels different now. The exhaustion is still there. The resentment is still there. The emptiness is still there, and this time, the helper notices it. This is the moment Jesse Livermore would call the beginning of discipline, the point where a person stops reacting emotionally and starts observing emotionally. Livermore taught one principle that applies perfectly here. You only change your behavior after you finally understand the cost. And the helper now understands the cost of overgiving, the cost of always being available, the cost of rescuing everyone except themselves. The narrator leans closer, explaining the psychology. This is where the helper's breakthrough rule is born. A rule that shifts their entire emotional strategy. If giving costs me my peace, it's too expensive. The helper repeats this quietly. They don't fully believe it yet, but they feel its truth, and the first real breakthrough happens. Not when they say no to someone else, but when they say yes to themselves. It might be something small, not replying immediately, not taking on someone's emotional chaos, not apologizing for resting, not forcing themselves to show up when they're empty. For the first time, they'd choose themselves in a moment they would have given themselves away. And it feels strange, uncomfortable, almost wrong. Because helpers are not used to receiving. They're not used to protecting their energy. They're not used to putting their needs first. This discomfort is expected. Psychological detox. Livermore said that when a traitor breaks an old habit, the mind rebels before it adapts. The helper is going through the same rebellion. But something beautiful happens next. Something subtle yet profound. The helper notices that one small boundary didn't end their relationships, didn't ruin their friendships, didn't make anyone leave. The world didn't fall apart when they stopped holding it up, and this realization becomes oxygen, the narrator explains. Helpers begin learning how to invest their emotional energy the way. Livermore invested money, not everywhere, not blindly, not desperately, but selectively. Livermore had a rule. Only invest when the reward is worth the risk. Helpers begin applying the same principle to people. They slowly realize not everyone deserves access to their energy. Not everyone deserves their time. Not everyone deserves their kindness. Not everyone deserves their emotional labor, because kindness is a gift, and gifts should be earned, not exploited. This is the breakthrough moment when the helper understands they are not responsible for saving everyone. They are responsible for saving themselves first. They begin removing themselves from draining conversations. They stop carrying burdens that aren't theirs. They start valuing their own feelings. They begin choosing silence over self-sacrifice, peace over pleasing, boundaries over burnout. And with each small shift, their identity begins to change. Not from kind to cold, not from helpful to selfish, but from self-reacing to self-respecting. Livermore would say, a man becomes wise not by winning, but by understanding why he kept losing. Helpers become wise the same way, by understanding why they kept giving. As this section ends, the narrator prepares the next stage. In the next part, we'll explore how this breakthrough transforms the helper's relationships, how people react, how dynamics shift, and how choosing yourself reveals who truly valued you and who only valued your help. And if you look around today, especially in the US, helpers are everywhere. The friend who picks up every call, the coworker who says, "Yeah, I can take that on," even when their plate is already full. The kid who grew up too fast because they had to be the strong one in their family. In America's fast, high-pressure, keep-moving culture, helpers burn out quietly because they think it's their job to hold everything together. But here's the truth every modern helper needs to hear. You don't have to be available 24/7. You don't have to fix every crisis. You don't have to carry people who refuse to stand on their own. Real-life application is simple. Say no without writing a whole essay to justify it. Take care of your mental bandwidth the same way you guard your money. Help people who actually value your time and effort. Give without draining. Care without collapsing. Because in today's world, protecting your energy isn't selfish, it's a survival skill.